We got a nice piece of offshore structure sitting right out here. We tried to fish it with a big worm, but then we went back through with a finesse worm and started catching some fish. It's not a big one, but in a tough tournament you can get bites with it. And that's what I want to talk about today, is the two different approaches to offshore fishing this time of year, because as we all know, offshore fishing can get kind of tough this time of year. So I want to talk about the two approaches you can take to help put more fish in the boat. Let's get back to it. So we've hit the point in the year where it's that late summer, early fall period, and once we get to this spot in the year, all of the fish that wanted to be offshore are already out there. They've been out there for the most part. They've been grouped up. They've gotten pounded when they first got out there, so they started to break up and get into smaller groups, and they're getting harder and harder to catch. Many of you guys notice this. You get out there, you get on a spot that's your best spot, you know, a big brush pile, a big offshore ledge, you catch one fish, and then they're done. They shut off, right? You get one or maybe 1 to 3 bites, and then they're done. And you're like, I know there's more fish there. But that's what's happening right now, is these fish, before they start to transition, before they start to spread out, they have been pounded and are getting tough. So there's two approaches that I like to take when it comes to offshore fishing, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the go big or go home attitude, or I want to talk about the get as many bites as possible attitude. And those rely on different baits and a little bit different positioning and just differences on how you fish the spots. And so what I'm also going to do is I'm going to break down how I get into fishing offshore a little bit, just as like a little bonus feature, so that way you guys know how to set up on it and how to better target your spots and catch more fish. But that's what we're going to talk about today. So like I alluded to, there's two approaches. The first one is the go big or go home method. And that's going to be throwing your big worms. That's going to be throwing your big swim baits. That's going to be football jigs, you know, your bigger profile baits that on average get bigger than average bites, that are targeting a better quality fish. And there's a way to look at that. And if you're fishing a tournament, it's a one-day tournament, and you want to go all out, by all means, you can go big or go home with this. And you can also look at it like, well, if I'm going to run these spots and I'm only going to get one bite, I want it to be as big a bite as possible. And so that's a good attitude to have, and that might work out, but you can also get burned on that. And so the baits that I'm thinking about with this, like I said, is that big worm, maybe a spoon, you know, that big swim bait, a big swim jig, a big spinner bait, depending on the conditions, big crankbait. You know, obviously it's going to change a little bit depending on what your conditions are. If it's overcast, you might be able to get away with a big crankbait, big spinner bait, calms down. That big worm, you know, big jig, that kind of thing. And that's a great attitude to have, but here's the problem with that, is it tends to wig people out. I know myself, I get a little bit nervous doing that, because you run 5 or 6 spots and you don't get a bite and you start to get in your own head, right? We've all been there, we've all done it, and so it can get really, really frustrating, but you just have to stay with it. That's the biggest thing when it comes to going big or going home, is keeping those bigger baits in your hand and sticking with it and having enough spots to run it. Because if you don't have enough spots, then it can really get problematic, because it's a high percentage deal. You know, if you're making 1 or 2 casts at brush piles, offshore ledges, you got to know you're going to have to work through some areas, because like I said, these fish have spread out a little bit. They're not all big clustered up right now. They're kind of half a dozen here, half a dozen there, or there's half a dozen in a brush pile if you're fishing that. And so you have to capitalize on it by getting the most bites, but you might not get bites if you're going with that go big or go home strategy. So that's something you have to take into consideration. Now, the other approach is going with something like a drop shot with a smaller worm, going with a smaller swim bait, a Carolina rig, because as we all know, these baits get big bites, but they also get numbers of bites. And so there's a problem that you're going to run into, but there's also like, you're also going to catch fish, right? That's going to be the one thing you're going to have going for you, is you're going to get bites. But the problem that you're going to run into is they're not always going to be the biggest bites. And so if you pull up on a brush pile and there's 10 fish in there, one of which being like a 7 or 8 pounder, and then some 3 pounders, and then a bunch of 2s and short fish, what you can run into is you catch the smaller fish first. You'll get that bite and you'll feel them taking off out of the brush pile, and as soon as you catch that fish, those other fish kind of wise up and go, I don't know. And you can have a good day with it, don't get me wrong. You can have a good day and you can catch numbers of fish, and it can work out really, really well in your favor. But just know going into that, you're not going to get the biggest fish every time. And so that's going to be the two different approaches, is figuring out which baits you need to throw in which situations and know why you need to throw it. If it's a one-day local tournament, there's no points involved, by all means, swing away. If you're an experienced angler, you're in a Bassmaster Open circuit, and you're, possibly going to make the elites, you might want to go with a more, if you're in your point standings for your local clubs and you want to just, have a solid finish, going with that drop shot, that finesse jig, that smaller bait might be the way to go. But none of these work if you don't have the right approach this time of year. And that's something that I really want to drive home, because offshore fishing this time of year can be really, really, really tough. And if you don't have the right tools and the right mentality for it, you're going to get burned. And I've seen guys do it over and over again. It's something that I've really learned, is offshore fishing this time of year is a timing deal. 150%. You have to be there when those fish are going to fire. And that means rotating through spots. That means running to spots over and over again, having 20 or 30 spots that you continually hit. And different fish are going to pull up at different points throughout the day. That's going to be absolutely critical. And here's what I also want you to note. If you get bigger bites in a certain stretch or on a brush pile or at a certain point that has a hard spot on it, there's going to be more fish there, and there's a reason those bigger fish there. And that's going to be something that I'm going to keep in my rotation. Also, brush piles that you get bigger than average bites out of. Fish this year tend to group up by size. So if you get a bigger bite, chances are there's other bigger fish there. And so what I'm really going to do is I'm going to keep these baits on my deck, depending on which I'm going for the go big or go home, or going for the number of getting bites. And you have to just know that just because you hit that spot at 6:30 first thing at takeoff doesn't mean that's the only time you're going to get bit on it. And so a lot of guys have a tough day and they're like, man, I caught him in practice. I caught him just yesterday, and I went out there first thing this morning to get on it real quick for the first day of the derby, the first morning of the tournament, to get on it quick, and I just didn't get bites. Well, you have to think about what time of day you got bit when you were there. That's something you really have to notice. If you're practicing, if you're fun fishing and you get bit and it's 2 in the afternoon, chances are those fish are getting there at 2 in the afternoon. They might be roaming around. Think about that brush pile, that ledge, like they're home. They're still going to go do other things, but they're going to come back to that spot. And so you have to be there when they reload on that, and you're going to have to be there when they're feeding on that too. And so if I find a particular brush pile or a particular ledge that I'm getting bit on or hard spot, I might go through that 3 or 4 times a day. And the key is I'm going to pull up on it. And I have Garmin Live Scope on my boat, and I have a Humminbird 360, so I can line up and watch my cast. If you guys can't, just having that waypoint and understanding to try to be as accurate as possible. So I'll pull up a little bit off of it, get closer to it, fire that cast. I'm only going to make less than, probably 6 casts. If I don't get bit in 6 casts, he ain't eating. And that's something that I really want to drive home, is this time of year when you pull up to these spots, if they're going to eat, they're going to eat within the first 6 casts, especially brush pile fish. And if you don't get bit in those first 6 casts, they ain't eating. Come back later. Come back at a different time, they're closed. And so that's why I will keep rotating through it, but marking the ones that I've gotten bigger than average bites out of. Because if you idle over these brush piles and you see a lot of crappie in it, chances are there's probably not a lot of bass in it. So if you idle over them and there's skinny brush piles with only a few dots in it, those are going to be your bigger bites. That's where you're going to get those bigger fish, because there's less bait present. But just keeping that rotation in mind is going to be absolutely critical. And so one bait that works really, really, really well offshore that gets a lot of bites is a Carolina rig. And I'm going to have this video linked up here that is going to discuss what I think everyone should know about fishing a Carolina rig. So go ahead and check that video out if you guys like today's video and want to learn a little bit more. Also, if you like today's video, hit that like and subscribe button to follow on with the content that I have coming out every week. But thank you guys so much for watching. God bless. And, I hope you all take care, and I hope to see you in the next video.